among 24 years, the honor of teaching confirmation for 24 years, actually during my internship, if that's included, over 25, that sounds better. One of the great confirmation classes last night. Really and truly, no hyperbole, not that I would ever. One of the great confirmation classes. So we are in the unit in confirmation called Jewish spirituality, or in other words, God. And teenagers, as you know, confirmands, especially 10th graders, some can be ambivalent about the whole idea of theology and God. Some have some pretty strong beliefs in science to the extent that if it can't be proven, then it can't be real. Some still believe what they were taught as younger kids in religious school about God, sitting up in heaven on a chair, judging us, pulling the puppet string, so to speak. Right there, it's all over the place with teenagers. But last night, I thought, let's study a little Rambam, a little Maimonides. And we studied the following two texts to present to the confirmands, our beautiful 10th graders, two competing ideas, if you will, but fundamentally important ideas in Judaism about God that Maimonides wrote about. And if Maimonides wrote about it, then that's kind of important. It's a big deal. And what it was is the paradox, if you will, or the juxtaposition, if you will, of free will and God, who is omniscient and omnipresent, all-knowing, all-powerful. How do we have a God that is all-knowing and all-powerful and have the ability to use our free will in making decisions? That was the question presented to the confirmands, okay? And then we studied Rambam. Now, this is all going to connect to the Torah portion in just a second, but I'm going to give you a brief overview of the two texts that we studied last night in confirmation. Former confirmands will remember this from when we learned about it. Okay. Here's what Maimonides says about God and the existence of God. Okay? God is the cause of all existence. In God, all else subsists and from God derives. God is sufficient to God's self. God is one, the cause of all oneness, and absolutely eternal. So Maimonides picks up here on a theme from Aristotle, who lived many centuries before him, that God is sufficient and necessary to God's self. So the question I asked the confirmands, we have all asked this question, especially when we were kids, who invented God? When was God born? Who gave birth to God? Where did God come from? And the answer, according to Maimonides, is God is actually the cause of all existence. In God, all subsists and from God derives. God is both sufficient and necessary to God's self, which means no answer to that question. God has always existed, God exists, and God will always exist. And God did not need, God is so powerful and mighty, God doesn't need anyone to give birth to God. Nothing came before God. There was nothing before God except God, and that's fine. And after the world ends, God will still exist. So that is Maimonides, in 2 minutes or less, idea or definition of the existence of God. God has always existed, God exists, God will always exist. By the way, you don't have to believe in God in order for God to exist. God is the cause of everything. Okay, yay. One down, one to go. So we worked on that, we talked about that, and we talked about, asking that question as a kid, who made God, where did God come from? And that was Maimonides' answer, and this is a fundamental Jewish principle, right? Maimonides gets credit for being, as they say in Jewish folklore, from Moses, from the Torah, till Moses, of Moses Maimonides, there was no one like Moses, right? So you've got Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses of the Torah, Moses Maimonides. They're on the same level playing field. But here's what he says about free will, which is going to confuse us, as it should. A human being's conduct, Maimonides says, is entirely in his or her own hands. Were a person compelled to act according to the dictates of predestination, that is to say, if I'm to act according to a belief that God's already decided it, because God is all-knowing and all-powerful, that the future is already decided, if I live that way, if I'm compelled to live that way, then all of the commandments, the mitzvahs and the prohibitions and the laws, the positive and the negative laws, all of them would become null and void. And the law would be completely false, since a person would have no freedom of choice in what he or she does. Now, one of the confirmands said this actually before we studied this text, that one of the ideas about free will is that if we didn't have free will, there'd be no reason to live. There'd be no reason to exist. There'd be no reason to be Jewish. There'd be no reason to have rules. If everything was already decided for us ahead of time, let it loose. Do whatever you want to do. They talked a little bit about that movie, The Purge, that series, the movie The Purge, which some of you probably heard of. We talked about, not such a great example, we did talk about Lord of the Flies a little bit, and about anarchy and what anarchies look like, and how when there are no rules, and these kids on that island decided the rules didn't turn out so well for Piggy. So we talked about what happens when free will is removed, but more importantly, why free will is so important and valuable and meaningful. That free will in and of itself almost gives us a reason to live, but more importantly, a reason to learn and engage in the tradition of Judaism and the mitzvot. Because of that one line, more specifically, we all have the ability to choose. It's in our own hands. Were we compelled to act according to the dictates of predestination? That is to say, if we walk around saying, already been decided. It's already been decided. God already figured it out. All of the rest of it's null and void. There's no reason to engage in it. And the kids got both of these things, and the conversation was phenomenal. And what we learned was how important in Judaism it is to understand the friction from these two concepts, an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-being of God, and our ability to choose, right or wrong, good or bad. Our ability to decide on our own. Not only our ability, but our fundamental existence being predicated on that free will, what choices we make. Now, why do I bring these things up? Because in this week's Parsha, as Jason mentioned, we read the 10 Commandments. The problem is that the first commandment, and maybe Maimonides, well, I know Maimonides knew this, but maybe Maimonides was making a commentary on this. Can someone tell me the first commandment that you know? I am the Lord your God. I am Adonai your God. Finish the line. I had to look at my cheat sheet. Better in the Hebrew, right? Asher hotzeti echem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God, Adonai your God, who brought you out of bondage from Egypt. That's not a commandment. That's not a thou shalt or thou shalt not. I've talked about this in prior years. It's like a statement of principle, right? It's like a pre-statement to the rest of the commandments. And that's, as I say to the kids, the punchline being, God exists whether you believe in God or not. I am God, God exists. That's what God is saying, at least in the first commandment. It's not a commandment. We should really call it the 9 commandments, with the first one being a statement of sort of a prelude. So, on this Shabbat, it was great and very timely that we studied the text about free will and the text about God being God's existence in context with the first commandment. So my question for you on this Shabbat, and I'd love to get a couple answers, brief answers, is how do we do this? How do we break this very confusing religion that we are part of? This very important mandate that we follow, that God exists, that everything comes from God, that God has power and knowledge, and there is such a thing as predestination for God, at least. God knows everything, right? And still have the ability, the capacity, and I would say the fundamental right to choose. how do we do that? How do we pull that off? Does anyone want, this is what you're going to think about this Shabbat. That's your assignment. So I want to just get a couple of responses. Yes. How do these things coexist? They seem so terribly, they seem like they cancel each other out. Yeah?
Some physicists say, I'm not a physicist, that light, depending how you examine it, is particle, and then they say, but it's also wave, and they both can't be true, and yet they are.
Say it again?
That light, in its most fundamental form, some kind of particulate, photon, or they say, it's waves, but the problem is both those things can't be true
At the same time.
Yet, depending on how you examine it, they're both true.
Okay, so there's this example given of light being from pure light versus the waves that cause it, right? Something like that. And the definition of where light comes from is somewhat ambiguous because they both can't be true. They cancel the other one out, right? Something like that. I hope I said that right. Yes, please.
And God gives us the ability to make choices.
God gives you the ability to make choices, yes.
And so he is condoning that.
So God condones the free will. If we look back to the first story in the Torah where free will is exercised, Garden of Eden, God doesn't kill Adam and Eve, right? If this free will thing was going to be, if we were going to go on the side of, if God was anti-free will, first of all, perhaps they wouldn't have been set up in the way that they were, but more importantly, they got punished. And as Jason pointed out to the kids last night, the good thing about free will, or the bad thing, depending on how you look at it, is there are always consequences to your choices. Sometimes you get credit for making a choice. We talked about Rosa Parks a little bit last night. Rosa Parks wasn't anyone special, significant. No one knew who Rosa Parks was until she made the choice not to get up from her seat. Rosa Parks then becomes almost like a forefather of our country out of one choice that she made. The entire civil rights era is defined. For many of us, when we were kids and we were learning about it, everyone learns the story of Rosa Parks. And I told the confirmands, of course, last night, because this is what you tell teenagers, is you can all decide to be Rosa Parks. You can all make a decision that may not be convenient at the time, it may not be right. God wants you to do that. But in order for that to happen, as far as the merit of the outcome is, there's the other side. With confirmands, it's appropriate to talk about drunk driving. You make that choice and get in a car inebriated, you could change the trajectory not only of your own life, but someone else's life permanently. But God puts that into the ingredients as well. What I'm hearing, and what I think we all know, is the same goes for truth, the same goes for other abstract concepts like love, justice, that they exist no matter what we think, feel, or believe. Like again this morning, we're watching the news and we're hearing about this arrest of Roger Stone, and at the same time, airplane traffic controllers are not able to handle in the Northeast these routes because of the thing. And what does the media do? Explodes it, scares us, makes us all crazy. In all of that stuff that's making us so crazy, there is truth. We don't know what the truth is. We don't know what the outcomes are, but we will. Why? Because God exists. Meaning the truth exists, love exists, justice exists. Whether we have an opinion one way or another, the truth will come out. That's that God part. The free will part is, what do we do in the meantime? How do we tolerate that ambiguity, whether it's about light or about what God wants or doesn't want from us? How do we tolerate difference of opinion and ideas in different ways and reasons and rationales for truth? Right? Just think about the Jewish community. Think about Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews and conservative Jews and the Talmud and all the fighting that goes on, right? The Talmud is just one big book of fights, of intellectual debates. But the truth is the truth. That is the piece that God exists. The truth exists. Justice exists. That's the part that God knows, that we as human beings don't know. But our actions, our choices, our free will, and how we exercise it can determine not only outcomes, but can, since it's part of that mix of what God wants from us, can determine how we react, how we tolerate, how we as a community deal together with difference of opinion, difference of ideas, difference of truths. So the punchline tonight will be from the following then. This I did not share with the confirmands. By the way, everything I've just said was from the confirmands, from the 10th graders last night. I'm just giving you a briefing, if you will. I facilitated it. I shared the text. These are all their thoughts and their ideas. We should be very happy and proud that our kids are making the effort to continue learning Torah beyond Bar and Bat Mitzvah. So here's the punchline. Maimonides then says the following regarding the first commandment. The first mitzvah, number 1, is that God commanded us to believe in God. That is, that we believe that there is a cause and a motive force behind all existing things. This idea is expressed in the statement, I am the Lord your God. So he takes the position that it is a prelude, that it is a preface to the other commandments. Again, God is a force behind all things that exist, which means God is the force that is driving the outcomes, but those outcomes are driven through our free will one way or the other. You want civil rights, you have to have people like Rosa Parks. You do. I told the kids, you want to make a difference in this world? It's not about what you do on your resume or your GPA or your SATs. It's about how you act, how you live. It's about understanding the idea that God is the force of existence before, during, and after our lives. Truth is true before, during, and after whatever we think truth is. Justice, love, and so on. They are permanent ideas, laws, if you will, and while they seem like they're in conflict, they can and actually do exist simultaneously. And the friction between the two, free will and God's existence, that friction is what makes it so, for me at least, fun to be Jewish and have these conversations with our confirmands. So on this Shabbat, at your Shabbat tables, please have this conversation. Continue the conversation. It's not zero-sum for us. Both exist, both can exist, both of these ideas. We have free will, that's part of the plan. But what it is or how it is that God plays a role in all of that, that is also true. Talk amongst yourselves. Shabbat shalom.